The dinner was at the Gilded Oak, a place with heavy gold curtains and chairs that cost more than my first car. It was our 10th anniversary, a decade of what I thought was building a life together. Randy stood up, clinking his crystal glass with a silver spoon to get everyone's attention. He looked every bit the rising star in his tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly gelled. I sat there smoothing my dress, waiting for the heartfelt, "I love you," or the mention of our 10 years of marriage. Instead, he looked toward his boss and thanked his mentor for the upcoming opportunity of the VP role. Then he turned his gaze toward me with a condescending smile. He joked to the whole table about how my supportive, domestic nature allowed him to work the late nights required for such a high-level position. He made it sound like my only job was keeping his socks clean so he could conquer the world. The table erupted in polite, wealthy laughter. I didn't argue or frown. I just took a slow, cold sip of water, feeling the ice against my teeth as I watched the man I thought I knew disappear behind his own massive ego. My name is Bianca. I am 34 years old, and for the last 3 years, I have lived a double life. To Randy, I was a quiet wife with a little job he didn't care to understand. In reality, I worked as a senior integration consultant for a global firm that specialized in massive corporate takeovers. Randy never bothered to learn the details of my daily work. He always patted my head and called it my data entry hobby. He treated my office hours like I was playing a game of Tetris instead of managing multi-million-dollar transitions. As he sat there at our anniversary dinner, bragging about being a shoo-in for the promotion at his company, a cold realization settled in my chest. He hadn't asked about my career goals, my projects, or my day in over a decade. He saw me as a piece of furniture that kept his house warm, not a professional peer. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he never noticed I was actually the architect of the very corporate merger that would soon decide his entire professional future. I realized then that my silence hadn't been passivity. It had been an accidental disguise that I was now going to use. Midway through the dinner, I went to the restroom to splash cold water on my face. Halfway there, I realized I'd left my phone on the table and doubled back to grab it. I stopped just behind a heavy velvet curtain near the alcove where our table sat. I heard Randy's voice, hushed but sharp with an edge of cruelty I had never heard before. He was leaning in close to his boss, whispering about our life. "Bianca is great for the home stuff," Randy told him. "But she doesn't have the killer instinct for the high life we're moving into. Once the promotion is official, I might need to reevaluate things." My heart hammered against my ribs as he continued. "I need a partner who matches my new status, someone who commands a room, not someone who hides in the corner with a spreadsheet." He was already planning to discard me like an old coat once he reached the top. He saw me as a social liability, a domestic anchor holding back his brand. I stood frozen behind that curtain, the fabric smelling of old dust, realizing that my 10 years of loyalty meant nothing compared to his thirst for a title. I grabbed my phone and walked back slowly. The car ride home from the Gilded Oak was completely silent on my end. Randy didn't notice because he was busy humming a triumphant tune to himself, high on the wine and his own perceived power. He kept adjusting his tie in the rearview mirror, looking at himself like he was already the king of the city. I looked out the side window, watching the yellow streetlights blur into long glowing lines as we sped down the highway. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't ask him why he said those things behind the curtain. The time for emotional outbursts had passed the moment he decided I was redundant to his future. Instead of dwelling on the betrayal, I just thought about the Alpha Tech merger contract sitting in my encrypted work inbox. I thought about the spreadsheets he called hobbies and the data points that he thought were beneath him. He had no idea that the company he worked for was being swallowed whole by a giant, and I was the one holding the mouth open. While he was dreaming of his new corner office, I was looking at the streetlights and realizing that the power dynamic in our house had already shifted. He just didn't know it yet. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, biting cold. Randy left early in his best tailored suit, kissing my cheek as if he were doing me a favor. He told me to have a productive day at the computer, his voice dripping with that same fake kindness. Once the door clicked shut, I opened my laptop and the blue light hit my face. I wasn't just a consultant anymore. The merger was moving into its final, aggressive phase. I was officially the lead integration architect for the global firm that was acquiring his company. My job description was simple, but devastating. I was the one who had to determine who stayed and who went after the merger was finalized. I had to look at every department, every manager, and every rising star to see if they actually added value or if they were just expensive, dead weight. For months, I had been looking at his company's books from the outside, but now I had total access to the internal reality. Randy thought he was climbing a ladder, but I was the person who owned the building the ladder was leaning against. I spent the morning reviewing performance metrics, and the numbers for his department were starting to tell a very ugly story. At dinner that Tuesday night, Randy was in a foul mood. He complained loudly about a difficult woman at the parent company who was making the audit hard for him. He slammed his fork down, grumbling about how this mid-level bureaucrat was asking too many questions about his quarterly projections. "She's just some woman trying to prove herself by being difficult," he scoffed, shaking his head. "She doesn't understand how big-time business actually works. She's probably just some power-tripping assistant who got a fancy title." I sat across from him, the same woman he was talking about, and calmly passed him the salt. I kept my face perfectly neutral, a mask of the supportive wife he expected to see. "That sounds incredibly frustrating, Randy," I said softly. I watched him shake the salt onto his steak, completely unaware that the difficult woman had spent her afternoon flagging his department for a deep-dive investigation. He was so blinded by his own sexism that he couldn't imagine a woman, especially not his wife, having the authority to challenge his work. He wanted a listener, so I listened. I listened to every mistake he made and every arrogant assumption he voiced, filing them all away for the upcoming leadership summit. I spent my nights documenting. While Randy slept soundly, dreaming of his VP title, I was in my home office with the door locked. I wasn't looking for evidence of infidelity. Randy was far too arrogant to think anyone was better than him, so he didn't even have the imagination to cheat. What I was looking for was his professional lack of integrity. As I dug through the internal servers, I found a consistent pattern. He had been taking credit for the work of his junior developers for years. Specifically, a young man named Leo had written the core architecture for their latest software, but Randy's name was the only one on the final report. He'd been riding on the backs of hard-working kids, using their talent to polish his own reputation while he spent his days playing golf and networking. I didn't report it to his current boss or make a scene. I was clinical and organized. I gathered the original timestamps, the raw code, and the email trails that proved the theft of intellectual property. I organized every single piece of evidence into a digital folder on my secure server. I labeled the folder Integration Assets. To the firm, these were just facts. To Randy, this folder was the end of everything he had built. A few days later, Randy asked me to host a brunch for his team. He told me it was a vital move to seal the deal for his promotion. He wanted the bosses to see him as a family man with a perfect, traditional home. I agreed without a fight. I spent the entire Saturday baking and smiling, filling the house with the scent of cinnamon and expensive coffee. As the guests arrived, his colleagues treated me like a waitress. They would hand me their empty glasses without looking at me or ask for more napkins, while they discussed high-level strategy right in front of my face. They assumed I was invisible because I was wearing an apron and serving quiche. It was a huge mistake on their part. I listened to their internal projections, their complaints about the merger, and their secret plans to jump ship to a competitor if the deal didn't go their way. I didn't need a notepad. I recorded every word in my mind with perfect clarity. By the time the last guest left, I knew more about the internal rot of Randy's department than his own CEO did. I cleaned the kitchen in silence, knowing that the housewife mask had served its final, most important purpose. A formal, heavy envelope arrived in the mail the following Monday. It was a mandatory leadership summit for the merger, held at a luxury hotel downtown. Randy was ecstatic when he opened it. He waved the gold embossed card in the air like a trophy. "They invited spouses, Bianca. This is it. This is the official announcement." He beamed, his eyes wide with greed. Then, he looked me up and down with a critical eye. "I need you to wear something simple. Nothing too flashy or loud. And please, for heaven's sake, don't talk too much during the cocktail hour. Nunam is right. I don't want you making me look unrefined in front of the board." He said it like he was giving me a helpful tip, but the insult was sharp. He truly believed that my presence was something he had to manage, like a blemish on his professional record. He wanted me there as a prop, a silent, good girl, who would smile and look pretty while he took the stage. I nodded and told him I understood perfectly. I promised him I would stay out of the way and let him do the talking. I let him believe he was the star of the show for just a few more days. On the Tuesday before the summit, I went shopping. I didn't go to the little boutiques Randy liked. I went to a high-end tailor and bought a navy blue power suit, the kind of suit that whispered about boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions. It was sharp, perfectly fitted, and made me look 6 feet tall. I didn't bring it into the house. I hid it in the trunk of my car, tucked away under a spare blanket. For the actual drive to the summit on Thursday morning, I wore exactly what Randy expected, a soft, floral wife dress that made me look harmless and sweet. Randy patted my hand as we pulled into the hotel parking lot, his touch condescending and light. "Good girl," he whispered, looking at my dress with approval. "You look just right. Just remember the plan. Stay by the buffet, mingle with the other wives, and look pretty. I'll come find you after the big announcement is made." He was so confident, so sure of his place in the world, that he didn't notice the cold, steady fire in my eyes. He thought he was leading me into his world, but I was actually inviting him into mine. As soon as we reached the hotel lobby, the paths began to split. Randy was directed toward the executive suite for a pre-meeting cocktail with the other candidates. He gave me a final, warning look before disappearing behind the heavy oak doors. I didn't head for the buffet or the spouse lounge. I walked straight to the hotel's business center. I had a bag waiting for me at the front desk. I went into the private changing room and shed the floral dress like a skin I had outgrown. I stepped into the navy suit, the fabric feeling like armor. I pinned my hair back into a tight, professional bun and put on my glasses, which gave me an air of studious authority. I looked in the mirror and didn't see the domestic wife Randy mocked. I saw the woman who held the fate of 1,000 employees in her hands. I saw the lead integration architect. I took a deep breath, checked my watch, and walked toward the main auditorium. My transformation was complete. I wasn't hiding anymore. I was finally dressed for the job I had been doing in the shadows for 3 long years. I walked with a purpose that felt like a heartbeat. The auditorium was massive, filled with the hum of nervous energy and the smell of expensive cologne. I didn't enter through the main doors where the spouses were being ushered. I used the side entrance reserved for the consulting team and sat in the very back row, tucked into the shadows. From there, I had a perfect view of the stage. Randy was already up there, standing in a line with 4 other candidates for the regional director position. He was beaming, his chest puffed out, scanning the front rows for his boss. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery. He didn't see me in the back. He didn't even think to look for me anywhere other than the buffet table. I watched him laugh at a joke another executive made, his posture radiating a false sense of security. He was so caught up in the theater of success that he failed to notice the silence falling over the room as the lights began to dim. The game was about to change, and Randy was still playing by the old rules. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the introduction that would shatter his carefully constructed reality forever. The CEO of the parent company, a tall woman with silver hair and a reputation for being ruthless, took the microphone. The room went silent instantly. "We've spent 6 months evaluating this merger with Alpha Tech," she began, her voice echoing through the speakers. "This hasn't just been about numbers, it's been about finding the right leadership for our future. The decision on who will serve as the new regional director was not made by me alone. It was made by our lead architect, who has been deeply embedded in your data, your culture, and your performance metrics for months." I saw Randy lean forward on the stage, a smug smile playing on his lips. He probably thought embedded meant someone had been watching his golf games or his networking lunches. He was so sure the recommendation would be his name. The CEO continued. Our architect has looked past the titles and the bravado to find the true heart of this operation. She has identified the strengths we need to keep and the redundancies we must eliminate. I stood up slowly in the back of the room. The moment of the reveal had arrived. Every eye in the room turned toward the CEO, waiting for the name that would change their careers. Please welcome your new boss and the person who will lead the integration of both firms, the CEO said, her voice commanding and clear. Bianca Thorne. I stepped out from the shadows and began the long walk down the center aisle toward the stage. The sound of my heels clicking against the hard floor was the only noise in the entire room. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to punctuate the sudden, suffocating silence of the crowd. I felt the weight of hundreds of stares, but I didn't look left or right. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage. As I got closer, I could see the confusion on the faces of the executives in the front row. They recognized me as the woman who had served them brunch just days ago, but now I was wearing a suit that cost more than their monthly mortgage. I walked with my head high. The waitress they had ignored now appearing as the person who held their contracts. The air in the room felt thick with shock. I climbed the steps to the stage, moving with a confidence that left no room for doubt. I wasn't just Randy's wife anymore. I was the person in charge. I finally reached the center of the stage and turned to face the candidates. Randy's face didn't just drop, it turned a shade of gray I had never seen on a living human being. His mouth hung open slightly, and he actually stumbled back a single clumsy step, as if I had physically pushed him. His eyes were wide, darting from my navy suit to my face, searching for some sign that this was a prank. He looked like he was having a stroke in slow motion. I didn't look at him with anger, and I certainly didn't look at him with love. I didn't look at him at all at first. I looked past him, directly at the audience of hundreds. Good morning, I said into the microphone. My voice was steady, professional, and entirely devoid of the domestic sweetness he had spent a decade demanding from me. The silence in the room was absolute. I could feel Randy's gaze burning into the side of my head, a mix of horror and dawning realization. He was beginning to understand that the data entry hobby he mocked was actually the weapon I had used to dismantle his entire world. The good girl was gone. The meeting lasted for 2 grueling hours. I didn't spend the time talking about feelings or the betrayal I had suffered. I was a professional. I presented a 50-slide deck that performed a surgical strike on the company's current structure. I went through the data department by department, showing exactly where the money was being wasted and where the talent was being suppressed. I used Randy's own data entry terminology against him, throwing his patronizing words back into the room as clinical, cold, hard facts. I showed that under his leadership, the department was chronically underperforming and over budget. I was clinical, precise, and undeniably his superior in every way that mattered in that room. I saw him sitting on the side of the stage, shrinking into his chair as the board members nodded at my analysis. Every word I spoke was a nail in the coffin of his career. He had told me not to talk too much because I might look unrefined, but now, my words were the only ones that mattered. I finished the presentation with a clear roadmap for the future. A future that clearly had no space for the ego he had spent years cultivating. After the main session ended, the room broke into a chaotic buzz. I tried to make my way to the exit, but Randy managed to corner me in the narrow hallway leading to the executive offices. He looked disheveled, his tie crooked for the first time in his life. Bianca? What is this? Is this some kind of sick joke? He hissed, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. He tried to reach for my arm, but I stepped back, maintaining a professional distance. I looked down at my watch, checking the time with a flick of my wrist. I have a board meeting in 5 minutes, Randy. I don't have time for personal discussions right now, I said, my voice as flat as a sheet of glass. If you have a formal grievance regarding the merger or your department's audit, please feel free to schedule a time through my assistant. He stared at me, his face twisting in disbelief. He was waiting for the woman who would cry or apologize for tricking him. But that woman didn't exist anymore. I walked past him without a second glance, leaving him standing in the hallway, looking small and confused in the very building he thought he owned. Randy still didn't understand the full depth of his situation. He thought that even if I was the boss, he could at least keep his current job because of our history. During the scheduled one-on-one meetings later that afternoon, he walked into my temporary office with a look of smug defiance. He sat down and started to speak, but I stopped him by sliding a manila folder across the desk, the folder from Chapter 7. "We've completed the audit of your intellectual property filings, Randy," I said. His face went pale as he saw the names in the folder. I didn't raise my voice. "The junior developer, Leo, is being promoted to the regional director role you were eyeing. Our data shows he actually wrote every line of the code you claimed as your own for the last 3 years." I watched the last bit of color drain from his lips. He had been a thief, and I had the receipts. "You aren't just losing the promotion, Randy. You are being removed from your current position for cause. We don't have room for leaders who steal from their own team." The silence that followed was the sound of his entire professional identity collapsing into dust. When he realized the professional battle was lost, Randy tried to play the only card he had left, the marriage card. He leaned over my desk, his voice cracking. "You can't do this to me, Bianca. I'm your husband. We have 10 years together. You can't just ruin my life over a job. Think about our home, our future." I looked at him and felt a strange sense of pity, not because I loved him, but because he was so pathetic. I reached into my desk drawer and handed him another envelope. "I'm not doing this to my husband, Randy. I'm doing this to an underperforming, unethical employee who happens to be in my office," I said firmly. "And regarding the husband part, those are the divorce papers. You'll see that I'm being generous. You can keep the house. I don't want it. I actually bought a penthouse in the city 6 months ago with my data entry bonuses." He looked at the papers like they were written in a foreign language. He had spent 10 years thinking I was his shadow, never realizing I had been building a separate world for myself the entire time he was busy belittling me. Randy's shock quickly turned back into a desperate, ugly anger. He stood up, shaking the divorce papers at me. "I'll sue you for this. This is a massive conflict of interest. You used your position to target me. The board will fire you when they find out you're my wife." I actually smiled then, a small, genuine smile that seemed to infuriate him even more. "I disclosed our marriage to the board on day 1 of the merger talks, Randy," I told him calmly. "They were the ones who authorized the blind audit. They wanted to see if you were the kind of man who would try to use your wife's position to get ahead. But you didn't even do that. You were so convinced I was beneath you that you just ignored me entirely. You didn't even think I was worth using." He stood there, frozen. The board had watched him ignore his own wife for months, proving he had no situational awareness and no respect for the people around him. He had failed a test he didn't even know he was taking. I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Your security escort is waiting outside, Randy. Please don't make this more difficult than it already is." In a final, desperate move, Randy went to find his old mentor, the man who had been at the anniversary dinner. He expected the man to save him or use his influence to stop the termination. I watched from my office window as they spoke in the courtyard below. The mentor didn't look angry. He looked at Randy with a heavy, profound sense of pity. I later heard from my assistant what was said. "Randy, give it up," the man had told him. "She's the one who recommended we keep your pension intact instead of firing you for cause and stripping everything away. She's being more than fair to you after what you've done." Randy tried to argue, mentioning his years of service, but the mentor just shook his head. "You don't get it. You aren't some victim of a conspiracy. The data is clear, the theft is documented, and the new structure has no place for your ego. You're just redundant, Randy, in every sense of the word." The mentor walked away, leaving Randy standing alone in the rain, finally realizing that no amount of networking could fix the fact that he was professionally and personally hollow. He was a man with no allies left. The end was public and unceremonious. Randy had to clear out his desk in front of the entire office. He had spent years acting like the king of the floor, and now he had to pack his life into 2 cardboard boxes, while his former subordinates watched in silence. He looked small, his expensive suit now looking a size too big for his sagging shoulders. The domestic wife he had mocked at the Gilded Oak was now standing in the glass-walled executive office above the floor, looking down at the transition. He stopped for a moment, looking up at the glass, likely waiting for me to wave, or gloat, or show some sign of the killer instinct he claimed I lacked. But I didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I didn't smile, and I didn't frown. I just looked at him with the same neutrality I would use to look at a broken piece of office equipment. Then I turned back to my computer and kept working. I had a merger to finish and a company to lead. Randy was no longer a factor in my data points. He walked out the revolving doors, a box in his arms, and disappeared into the city traffic. 6 months later, the dust had finally settled. The merger was a documented success, and I was attending a high-profile industry gala. The room was full of light and music, a far cry from the stifling atmosphere of the old company. As I moved through the crowd, I saw a familiar face near the bar. It was Randy. He wasn't the rising star anymore. He was working for a struggling startup that everyone knew was going under. And he looked tired. His suit was wrinkled, and there was a frantic, small look in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He saw me and approached, his shoulders tensed as if he were expecting a fight or a public scene. He stopped a few feet away, clutching a cheap drink. "You destroyed my life, Bianca," he whispered, his voice thick with a bitterness that had fermented over the last half-year. "You took everything, my job, my house, my reputation. I hope you're happy with what you've done." He looked at me, waiting for me to defend myself or show a flicker of guilt. He still wanted to be the center of the story, even if he was the villain. I looked at him, and for the first time in years I saw him clearly. I didn't feel hate, and I didn't feel the old urge to please him. I felt total, absolute neutrality. It was the most powerful feeling I had ever experienced. "I didn't destroy anything, Randy," I said, my voice quiet but firm enough to cut through the gala music. "I didn't plant the evidence, I didn't steal the code, and I didn't tell you to mock your wife in public. I just stopped pretending you were the smartest person in the room. I stopped carrying the weight of your ego for you." I took a sip of my drink, watching him flinch at the truth. "You did the rest yourself. You built a life out of cards, and you're mad at me because I stopped holding my breath to keep them from falling." He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. He looked at me and finally realized that he didn't have any power over me anymore. Not even the power to make me angry. He turned away and disappeared back into the crowd, looking like a ghost in a room full of living people. I walked out of the gala alone, leaving the noise and the expensive perfume behind. I stepped into the cool night air and took a deep breath. There had been no shouting matches, no scandals, and no messy public confrontations. There was just the quiet, heavy weight of a life that was finally built on my own terms. I walked to the parking lot where my car sat under a street lamp. I remembered the night of our anniversary, watching these same lights as a passenger in a car driven by a man who didn't know me. Now, I got into the driver's seat of my own life. I put the keys in the ignition and felt the engine hum with a steady, reliable power. I drove toward my penthouse, toward a future where I was the only one holding the keys to my success. The road ahead was long and dark, but I wasn't afraid. I had spent years being the architect of someone else's dreams, but now I was finally building something for myself. I drove into the night, the silence of the car feeling like the most beautiful song I had ever heard.